Welcome to the Founders Foyer with me, Ashwarya. This foyer is full of conversations, the space where creators, founders, and builders look for all the support and concepts to grow their ideas into products. All of us like to meet interesting people. We love getting to know about their unique experiences, what inspired them, and how they've managed to ship something. We also like to be such interesting people, right? We love to share what we know. And we've also like constantly thinking and tinkering around to make amazing things. So, what signifies this interesting as an identity? How do we come up with ideas that not only elevates our own experiences, but helps us meet so many other brilliant minds around us? And what is this role of serendipity to help us in maximizing our success? If you're a product builder or a podcaster, publishing video content and looking for ways to simplify your creation journey, then Recast is your go-to app. Transform that one episode into months of engaging content. For Recast Studio is your AI-powered marketing assistant that helps you generate short-form video clips and audiograms. It also helps you write compelling show notes, blog posts, social media posts, newsletters, and so much more that resonate with your audience. No more struggling to find new ideas or spending so many hours just to edit and produce that content. Recast Studio does the heavy lifting for you, and you can focus on what you do the best, that is creating amazing podcast episodes. My experience with Recast has been super smooth. From uploading my episode to generating quick shareable snippets, this whole journey just takes me a couple of minutes. The best part is being able to pick my own template and letting AI do the rest of the magic, from generating the apt titles for my snippets to highlighting the best portions from my episode and converting that as video clips. Recast is the sponsor for this episode of the Founders Foyer. If you would like to check out Recast and use that for your video creation journey, then all you have to do is go to recast.studio, which is recast.studio. That's Recast Studio for you. I'll be happy to share my experience as well, so feel free to send me a message. Mind is already bombarding with so many questions, and I've got the one and only Danny Miranda here to answer all of them. Oh, he's otherwise very busy asking questions to the world's greatest thinkers. It's the famous podcast, The Danny Miranda Show, and has a fantastic roster of guests who shared their musings. Danny himself is praised as the best podcaster with so many business stalwarts. And he recently created Art of Interviewing, the course to learn about research, interviewing, and mastering the craft. Danny, I'm so glad that you're here on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the wonderful introduction.
Awesome. Danny, why don't we start with this? Why are you attracted to light?
I think I'm attracted to light because it feels better and it so clearly makes other people feel better as well. Just compare the experience of the physical light versus the lack of light. If you spend all day in the sun versus you spend all day in a pitch black room, which one of those experiences is going to feel better? It's almost like an absolute truth of humanity that the more time we spend in light, the better we feel. But what I don't think people realize is that there's a deeper layer of the light. It's not just light from the physical. There's also darkness that people are holding within their own bodies about their emotions, about the things that they have previously suppressed or don't want to look at, or if they don't want to be at a certain place or do a certain thing or think a certain thought, those are all elements of keeping yourself in the dark. And so I'm so attracted to the light because it feels better, and it so consistently feels better for other humans as well if they're willing to look at it and face it. It's a great question, though.
Right. Oh, that's lovely to know. And you know what really makes me go deeper into this is that you spoke about the dark part. And not often, we realize that we are in a dark phase or there is some amount of darkness for us to get ourselves led to the light. So you realized you're in a pursuit that helps you find like-minded folks. And that's exactly what you call is following the light, because you see them follow the light and you're like, hey, this is exactly how it's supposed to be done. So what was your form of darkness that led you towards this light? Or like, when did you really feel that this is what my light is going to look like?
So in September of 2019, I realized I was in my own darkness. And I realized I was in my own darkness by getting everything I wanted. So I had a job in San Diego where I could spend, I don't know, maybe like 10 hours a week doing it. And it was paying me great money. And I was living with my friends and I was 2 miles from the beach. And I was like, why do I feel so bad? Why am I in darkness right now if I have everything I want? And so I sat with it and I sat down and I literally started looking at it unconsciously. I didn't know I was looking at it, but I started meditating 20 minutes in the morning every single day
Mm.
for 90 days straight. And what I realized was that I was in a different place at the end of the 90 days than I was before. And understanding that by sitting in a room, I could solve my problems. What I was doing was I was putting my own attention to my own situation, which if we know our attention is valuable, because huge companies are willing to do a lot just to get our attention. They're willing to create these notifications that propel us and bring us towards their app over and over and over again.
Mhm.
We know companies spend a lot of money on marketing because they know that our attention is valuable. But when I looked at myself starting in September 2019, I was taking that attention that people were spending marketing dollars on and bringing it to my own heart, my own soul, and my own consciousness. And that was the transformative experience that helped put some light into my world. And a year after meditating, I started meditating in September 2019. A year after, I started the podcast, the most important project I've ever done in my entire life. So, what does that tell me? It tells me that by looking at our own darkness, we can actually evolve and grow. So, that's why that was my darkness and that was how I kind of went to the light.
Right. That's, what really brings me much resonating with what you said is there's sometimes a lot that we feel we are going through, and we feel like, yeah, like I've got a great job. I've really enjoyed doing this side project. But when you kind of like try explaining to people about, hey, there's something in me that's still not letting me move past who I am, or there's still some part in me that I'm yet to explore, it gets very hard to relate with people. They're like, hey, what do you mean? Because you've got everything. But this sense of, inner connect is something that I can totally understand. What made you get into meditation or what made you get into podcasting is definitely a very self-explorative journey. And I'm so glad that, you went through that. And honestly, when I speak to a lot of creative people around, this is something that keeps coming to me often from them that, hey, it could look like I've got everything, or it could look like a very external form of success. But internally, I know that there's definitely like a long path for me to go, or there is some amount of exploration that I do to understand what really excites me or what is still yet as a potential in me to do something.
Yeah. What was the darkness for you?
I think for me, again, it was the fact that I was interested in a lot of topics in general. Like the fact that reading anything was exciting for me. But for the longest time, I think I was not really putting that time and effort to understand, okay, this is something I want to do. And it's all the time was always lost in terms of planning. So there was this phase in life when I decided that, you know what, if ideas are going to come to me, I'm just going to like be a sponge. I'm just trying to observe, try to see what's really getting in me. If this idea is not meant for me, it's just going to float through me and then probably, get away without me trying to act on it. But if there is some amount of spark in me that is really trying to attract that idea, I wanted to pursue it. And this was even before I asked a million questions about, okay, is this good? Or is this like really trying to help me with the job? Or is this like going to help me build products? Nothing. I think even if there is a mild spark in me that I feel this is going through me and like trying to change me in some format, I think I was trying to make myself a bit livid than how I was before. So like I, a couple of years back, I still remember I used to be this plan perfect person who just loved coming up with checklists, who loved fine tuning my way of, actions and like say, okay, this after this after this. But now I definitely still am very organized, but I can see in the sense that I am open to ideas, and the fact that I'm always not preoccupied, I leave some amount of room in trying to observe this idea and in trying to see what of myself can I put into it. So I think that's really transformed me as a person. And definitely made me learn a lot about, different things in life. So yeah.
That's beautiful.
So for me, the darkness part was, I think, not letting myself exposed to it. So the frustration that would often come with, let's say, oh, I had this idea, but then I was not able to do it. Or, I had this whole, but when somebody does it, I was like, oh, that was my idea. I think I was really like,
Mm.
getting this a year ago, and why didn't I do it? So it was the fact that I was not really giving that time or energy or space to sit on it. Probably I was always like preoccupied. And in the sense that I was always planning perfect to be able to do that at some point in time, and always getting stuck with the planning. But I think that was, if you don't want to call it the layer of darkness, it was like the layer that was blocking me from what I could probably achieve, or like where I could go as from a step of learning or a step of curiosity. So I realized that even curiosity could be very different depending on what's stopping you from, going forward.
And what was causing that layer, that blockage?
To me, what was causing that was I was probably not giving enough time or room or space to think more about the idea and probably get into action. So getting lost in trying to see how to achieve it versus actually getting on in the learning. Like if I'm going to launch a podcast, I'm not going to sit 6 months and trying to get everything pitch perfect, but I'm just going to start with the episode, see what is something I can pick on in the way, and kind of get going in the pace of learning. So not waiting for things to be perfect, and not waiting for learning to probably occur only when things are just about right as you have conceived it in your head. But just getting, very scrappy, just being okay with starting, and then like learning all of the other things just as you do things on the way.
Yeah, what was the cause of the perfectionism in the first place? Like, when you go back to your childhood, which situation represents that?
Good question. And probably have not reflected it more from what's part of me from my childhood made me do that. But I think I was always, trying to see, oh, like this is probably the best version. This is probably the best thing that I could ever put through. So trying to see, or trying to always have the sense of self-criticism, right? Like in the sense that, oh, I think, I can do it better. It's not like this is the level. I still remember that there was one person that, probably in the friends of leadership coaching that I was once chatting with. Like I happened to meet her. And then after a conversation, she was saying, Aishwarya, you're like really great. You have a lot of good, interests. And you're this person who seems to be very curious. You like interacting with people, and you clearly enjoy a sense of doing many things together. But there's one thing that I can observe from what you spoke to me, in the sense that you don't sit and bask in the happiness of doing something. Like you're kind of jumping, okay, this is great, but what is greater? Like, this is amazing, but what could be even more amazing? So, I guess the sense of perfection was always not just about, I should say, getting something done perfectly, but it was more like, okay, I'm done with this. Like, what's the next? Even before I could actually sit down and like really feel about, okay, this is great. And like, you've put in your effort to do this. So I think the darkness part was definitely there for me before. It's probably traces of that is still there with me now. But I'm trying to move past that. I'm trying to see where the light comes in. So I could like spend more time on the light, and also like use the darkness in the times to refocus and splash back.
Yeah, and I think part of understanding your own darkness and understanding where the perfectionism comes from and where you are wanting to jump from one thing to the next stems from some situation or situations that you dealt with as a child and that you ingrained as the truth. And your ability to move past that perfectionism and the ability for you to move past the jumping from one thing to another stems from you being able to look at your childhood, looking at the situations that happened in your past and say, "Oh, it was from this. It was from that."
Exactly. Absolutely. And that's just like a little, like doing a podcast on my podcast kind of a thing. So thank you for pulling that off. And no, I'm very much on the same lines with you to say that it's very important to like just think about what you've been through as from a journey's perspective. And also, since you brought about the angle of journaling, I generally, tend to enjoy just writing down what I'm feeling through. It's not about using a filter. It's not about trying to say, oh, this sentence should look right, or this sentence should probably reflect all of what I think. Sometimes it's just like very silly, like just saying, oh, my mind is just thinking this, and then, not giving it a certain filter to perfect things, or like to come up with the right kind of a sentence. So just going through your own emotions and trying to really take a step back and look at it is for sure a great activity. And I'm actually been, I'm trying to do that over the last few months, and it's it's giving a lot of discovery, I would say, about myself. So I'm so glad that you're also doing that, and you propagate that.
Yeah, and I've heard from a lot of different people who say that when they journal, they sometimes filter themselves because they're
Mhm.
worried if someone reads it, or they're worried if a future generation reads it, how can I show my genuine, vulnerable, authentic self in this place? So it's great to hear that you have no problem doing that and you can just be you in your own safe space of a journal.
Yes, yes, very true. And I think largely the podcast that I've seen you do, and to a certain extent relates with what I do here with you now. These are mediums for me to also like try and be myself and try and get that candid, layer of this person that I'm talking to. The fact that there's no presumption, there's like no absolute sense to always like project the best successful sides of ours, but go ahead and kind of say that, hey, like I've been through this, and I see that you've also had a very similar journey. Like, come on, let's just sit over and chat about what each of our thoughts are. I think that's the best part of doing the podcast. To me, it's more than just recording, or it's just more than like trying to put snippet out. For me, it's to have this conversation with somebody, try to get what of their story inspired them to be like this, and get this whole transparent versions of themselves right in front of thousands of others who would want to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it it really is about connecting with the human soul, and that's what I find so amazing about podcasting. That's what I find so amazing about just talking to random people on the streets,
Mhm.
right? Just like it's like you can do a podcast in any moment, even if it's not recorded. There are people out there. I assume that most people listening to this are not just by themselves. I assume they cross paths with people they don't know. But do you have the courage to make an introduction or to ask the person, what was the best part of your day? Right? There are
Right,
so many little
right.
ways you can insert yourself into the flow of life. And so often we don't. I see people all the time and they're in their own worlds, and I'm in my own world too sometimes. And I get it.
Mhm.
And there's no judgment about it. But I encourage people, connect with another human being, because what you feel and what the other person feels on the other end of it is so much joy, appreciation for one another, and appreciation for oneself. So
Yes. Yes, yes. Completely agree with that. And I think this whole lens to going through the childhood, trying to see what's the best way to connect, is actually taking me forward to, much more thoughts that I would love for you to go on with. So let's touch upon this aspect of childhood. I know that you started blogging at the age of 13, and then you eventually went on to having your own e-commerce drop shipping based businesses, and there was also a track on doing fitness coaching and a lot of those other aspects of life. But boom, there was a moment that you came back to creating content just as how it was when you were 13. So looking back, what was it like to reconcile with this 13-year-old Danny, and what did you learn about the power of internet? Like, how do you think you're better informed now? And what would you say to the 13-year-old? And how do you reconcile back in that context?
it's interesting that we have the answers at such a young age. And what I view being 25 years old and putting out the content that I started to when I was 25 is like I was just reconnecting with the version of myself that was 13. And I had the answers at 13, but I didn't have enough trust or belief in myself at 13 that I actually did. And I think that's the number one thing I would, if I were to go back to my 13-year-old self, I'd be like, dude, you got this. You know exactly what to do. You're on the right path. Just keep doing what you're doing. You're spreading light into the world. You're showing love. Yes, you're not being taken seriously by a lot of people because you're 13. Yes,
Mm.
you don't have the experience to back this up, but guess what? It doesn't matter. Your intuition is correct. And someday you're going to be doing this regardless of if you suppress this or not. So I suppressed it for a long time, maybe like 12 years to be exact, full decade of my life. And that decade has served me in many ways. And now it's time for me to shed that layer of myself to get back to who I was at 13. So that's what I would say to my 13-year-old self. And that's kind of, that was the remarkable thing about coming back to writing at 25.
Right. And how is this power of internet that let you
Mm,
achieve that, you think what you've done, whether it was at the age of 13 where you were really fascinated about NBA and a lot of other things that happened around at that time, where blogging was definitely new and it was like, oh my god, like everybody has a blog, so let me go ahead and try my luck. So actually things are not very different now. I mean, like everybody right now thinks, oh my god, like I have to have a blog, or I have to start a newsletter, or I have to do a podcast. So I think times have not changed much, but the power of internet definitely has. So what
mm.
have you seen, about that part from what you've been through in your creative pursuit?
I remember just like looking at the internet when I was 13 years old and being like, this is amazing. The fact that I am in this place and that I can communicate with any person who's living and also has a connection to this thing. Like to me, the fact that that just is a thing, that you could just tweet something out and immediately thousands of people could see it, or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people could see it, to me was like, what is this? And how did this come to be? And so I guess being a 12-year-old or 13-year-old and seeing this firsthand and seeing this without understanding really the background of it or seeing it get built
Mhm,
slowly, like it was just like I learned about what it was and I was getting some lessons in school from it, but I wasn't like, I didn't know what it was like before. I just saw it and was
mhm,
like, "Oh my god, this is amazing." And that really stuck with me, and that can't go away from my mind. It never does. It never has left me. Of just like, the internet is incredible, and how don't people realize or see or understand that you could connect with any person, anywhere, anytime, and, like, you can just put out your voice, your message, and people could resonate with it or they cannot, and, like, I just am so amazed by the power of the internet, so, yeah.
right, right. I completely second that. And just as you were talking about how this was fascinating for you to like just feel like you're entering into another world, I think it takes me back to how similarly that I felt with respect to having this whole kind of a very different space through the internet. I mean, like, we've made friends. We've always had people that we met in our everyday lives, whether it was at school or whether college, at work. But there was this, I mean, when I was young, I never knew that you could make friends online, or you could actually like meet strangers online and really vibe with them to an extent where this whole sense of being there or being here just blurs out. And people ask you, how do you know this person? And you're like, well, I just don't remember. And you just go blank because you kind of know these people really well, but then you are at a loss of thought or words to understand what's really made you tick or what really made you vibe together. So I think for me, internet was that space where I was like, oh my God, you can make friends. You can like see people who have very similar thought process to yours. And it's like people are willing to help you. I mean, that's like the greatest deal for me. I was like, what? This is like really looking like an infinite sum game where I don't have to do something good, but then people are there to help me. If I'm going to ask a question, there's somebody who is willing to DM me. There's somebody who is willing to just be there and say, hey, this is how I've done this. So perhaps my quotient around how helpful can you be, how kind can you be, was also largely shaped by this internet space, I would say. So I can totally relate with you when you told me about this amazed kind of seeing at the internet.
Yeah, that's wonderful that someone else has had the very similar experience to me of just loving that people are so open and so helpful if you put that out into the world and if you lead with that energy as well. What you are
Mhm.
receiving is just the fact that you are that type of person who's open and curious and helpful, and the world is simply reflecting that back to you, which is a wonderful thing.
Yes. And this is something that Dr. Julie Garner was also like telling me when I earlier spoke to her on the show. She's trying to tell me how much it is important to kind of be open and use
Mm,
that energy, and what you put in reflects back. So I was telling her about how I stopped viewing at things in terms of time and space, but like trying to calculate or look at things more from the angle of energy. And I think that transforms the way you look at people or you look at experiences, right? So yeah, it was an amazing thought.
Yeah, and when you're looking at it in the first way, it's almost like you're keeping a checklist of like this person did this for me, so I'll do this for that person. Versus feeling in energy is like, how does this person make me feel? Do I feel more energized after talking to them? Do I feel like I'm more excited about the world and the world around me? So
Mhm.
yeah, that's wonderful. And that's very well said.
Yes. So now we're talking about energy and this whole learning of what made you or shaped you to be the person that you are. I know you've often quoted about the influence of your grandparents in the way that you've grown as a person. Could you walk us through some of the learnings or musings that you've seen or imbibed from them that you think is very essential to view the world at the pace at which it is now?
Yeah, my grandparents have given me so much. I mean, my from my grandpa, I get the sense of work ethic, discipline, the ability to value your life highly, but also be selfless in your life and give. From my grandmother, I got a real sense of love and care on my mother's side, and a real sense of just doing whatever it takes for the family's best interests. And then actually today, it's funny that you asked about my grandparents because today is the anniversary of my grandma on my dad's side. Exactly 8 years ago, she left her body, and I got from her a sense of faith and a sense of just I could tell how spiritual she was as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I I often think back and wonder, wow, like I would love to talk to her. I would love to learn from her about her spiritual side because it wasn't something that I really understood when she was here. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think about that often and my grandpa on my dad's side I never got to meet. But yeah, that was that's interesting that you ask about that today.
Yeah, I mean, how coincidental can it get? But I think not a lot of people often quote about the grandparents' influence. And when I really got to know about this side of yours, I was like, yeah, it's very important that for a lot of kids, and especially again, putting myself through in a very, very similar journey here, I have been raised by my, grandparents being by my side. So but to a larger extent, like you mentioned, you don't kind of like look back at these lessons when you're there with them in the sense that you're like, oh, yeah, like they're there, they're sweet, they're nice. But, when there's a time that when you grow through, and then there are some principles or some values that you strongly believe in. And at times when you think back and say, okay, where did I get this from? Or like, why did I start to believe in a certain thing? And then that is the time that you root back to your grandparents because there are like times that they have put this value in you or like they've tried to influence you in a certain way that you probably didn't use effort to take in and put it into you, but then it's just by the sense of being around them has come to you and has then reflected in your work and what you do in your creative pursuit.
Yeah, it's so interesting because my friend once said to me, he said, I could tell you're close with your grandparents just by being
Mhm.
around you. And I
Oh,
thought that was
wow.
so beautiful.
Yep, yep. I'm so glad that how was it that the person was able to like did they know that you had influence with your grandparents or what was that thing in you that was giving off for this person to just curious.
I think it was I I don't know. I didn't really ask them, but if I had to guess, it would be just an understanding for the deeper things in life, an understanding for
Right.
love and an understanding for wisdom or a want for love and wisdom. Because when
Mhm.
I guess when you get to be a certain age, that's really what you just want to pass on, love and wisdom. And yeah, it was definitely a special comment to me.
Oh, I can totally understand. And there's that warmth and the thoughtfulness that was probably giving it off and like definitely something that you would want to carry on for the kind of person that you are.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Right. So, Dani, I like we're talking about the whole similar stuff and how these kind of things resonate deeply for people who believe in similar values. There's one aspect of what you do with the Danny Miranda show that was fascinating for me, which is looking at the long term aspect of building relationships and value of knowledge. You record these conversations so that somebody might find it useful, let's say 10 years from now, 2 decades from now, in 2031, 41. And that is not often the lens with which most creators, if I can call with that term, look at trying to ship something, which is a piece of writing or a piece of podcast. In the
Mm.
age of virality, there's a lot of fancy little things around us that keep us sticking towards putting out content, having a content scheduler, trying to manage like viral parts of content. So, what keeps you looking towards this horizon? And can you elaborate? Why do you believe in the long term goal so that other creators can also look at it from a very similar lens?
I look at it from the long term because I ask myself, what would my grandchildren want to listen to? And how can I provide something for my grandchildren? So I don't know if my grandchildren will be around in 2031 or 41. I don't think that's likely or expected, but maybe 2061, 71, 81. And the reason for that is like I really think about what are the things and what are the lessons that I'd like to pass on. And my grandchildren probably won't care about their grandpa's little podcast 50 years ago, but it's really the ethos and the idea of passing along wisdom and love. And
Right,
that's really what I'm after. So that's kind of why I think about the long term.
right. So, I mean, like it's kind of interesting because you look at it not just from today's shipping something perspective, but I think this is also why the content goes well with people, sits well with them, makes them ruminate, is because you often don't fixate on things that other people fixate on. So probably that makes you stand out in the lens of creating content, I should say.
Like what?
I mean,
Like
like
what?
you don't focus on the whole, okay, I'm going to post this episode because it's going to get me like 10,000 likes. It's going to like really get me like so many retweets because this is going to be like a very interesting person that I spoke to. But I think you come more from the lens of, okay, I got this opportunity to sit down with this person. And for all the curiosity that I had about them, I think I've really gotten to know something. And maybe like a few decades from now, if somebody's looking at this content, they're like, oh, that's like a very interesting perspective. I never knew that, you could have this. Or I never knew people at that point in time had certain thoughts. And look at us now, or, like something of the sorts. Like you said, in 2061, 71, we don't know what people would be talking about. But it's fascinating to put those seeds of thought, I should say, like the way that content ages well. So that's why I said maybe you look at things very differently. And yeah, like the similarity part, because this is often what I tell my friends or I tell people when they want to start a podcast. They're like, what tools do I have to use? Or what is your content scheduling looks like? Like, what's your calendar like? And I'm like, okay, those are like too many jargons put to me at this point in time. To me, making a podcast is more about the conversation and like trying to say maybe like, a few years from now, if somebody's searching for how to be creative, and if some content that I've recorded is surfacing up for them, and they're like, oh, this is how you be creative, then I think that's the pursuit.
Yeah. It's looking for it's playing the game that's much longer and playing the game that is is more it's more sturdy. It's writing the
Hmm.
book instead of writing the tweet, and that's one thing I wanted to challenge myself to do in the coming year or so is like, what are you creating from a
Right.
writing perspective that is standing the test
Hmm.
of time or will stand the test of time? And I think it's a
Hmm.
worthy pursuit to ask ourselves that often.
Right. So what makes you think that writing or publishing a piece of content in written form would surpass time? Like, is there some belief in you personally that you think like this is how my thinking could get better, or are there like other paths to believing in writing?
Well, in terms of writing a book, I think about books are things that have lasted and been passed on from generation to generation, as well as there is an ability for it to be absorbed over a longer time horizon. If I if I write a long tweet that
Mm.
has, I don't know, 5,000 words, you might read it today and then you might forget about it tomorrow. Versus a book is like in your house, in your being. It's part of your physical location. And I do think even though the form is the same, it's both writing. One's on Twitter or LinkedIn and others on
Mhm.
just piece of paper. The fact that it's on piece of paper and that there's clear thought to it, like it makes a big difference to how it's received and how people sit with it, and it is in alignment with thinking about things from a longer time horizon. So I
Right.
I
Yeah.
I should be definitely writing a book sometime soon.
Oh wow. Like I'm very curious to see where that goes. And as somebody who's always been like a, person who vibes with the physical copy of books, I can't wait to see what you're going to be publishing. And it's kind of funny that you talk about the whole press side to books, because I know that there was a point in time that you said how podcasts are like printing press for audio, right? Because when you started a podcast, you clearly kind of didn't anticipate that this is going to like go this great and being able to connect with so many great minds and so many good thinkers, I should put it. So when you said that, it's like printing press for the audio, and I was like, oh wow, that's a nice way to put things through. And that's also why, most people instantly get attracted to this concept of a podcast. They're like, oh, I think I could start a podcast. And, but that's not giving them a longer curve, because some people start with that impulse, but then stop with the whole thought saying, okay, what if I start? Like, there are like already tens of millions of podcasts. Like, what difference would I make? Or what is it that is in me for me to like start a podcast? So, could you tell more about this thought of what made you start this when you actually also had like so many other podcasts out in the market?
Yeah, it was just that I wanted to do it. It was that I was doing phone calls with people. I was loving the process of doing phone calls with random strangers. Through Twitter, I put out who wants to talk on the phone. I had such amazing conversations. And then I was like, how do I do this more? And you do it more by pressing record on those conversations, which I did through Skype. And then I said, okay, like I love this. I love doing this and I love putting this out and let's keep doing it. And so I kept doing it. And that's a podcast is just a recorded phone conversation if you really boil it down to the most real elements. And yeah, that was it.
Right. So for all those who are hearing to in terms of trying to figure out what's the best tool to record video, what's the best tool to record audio, I guess it's a lot to just pick up the phone, probably like just scrappily start recording, because I think what you talk really matters in the podcast more than what elements or what measures are there around it to beautify it.
Yeah. It's really about the love of having a conversation and connecting with a human being. That's what to me the podcast is at its core.
Hmm. And there's one thing about podcasting that I often like run into in terms of thinking about this. There's a whole conversation which is like a podcast episode, but there are also like so many broken down snippets which people tend to say, oh, like I think when you post a podcast, it's also very important to think about what pieces of content do you highlight and share it on the socials or share it on the internet so people understand what your podcast is really about. But I also found this interesting study that podcasts tend to have a deeper, more meaningful connect, let's say over the longish time, than what short videos or viral content would really look like. So as somebody who's in this career of creating content, how do you see that? Like, what's worked for you? And in personal context, how do you see podcasts or longer conversations being more effective, probably than short form content?
Well, I mean, it's really funny. My friends Dylan Jardin and Henry Belcaster probably have the best example of this in that I think they got 1 billion views combined on their short form content over a year. 1 billion
Hmm.
views over a year. And then they started doing their podcast consistently and they got messages every day from people on Twitter telling them how much they love the podcast. And so they were like, how do we get more messages from the 50 podcast episodes that we published versus the 1 billion views? And it's because you're connecting more deeply with the listener. You're connecting with the human soul. You're really giving something time to breathe. You're you're allowing somebody to connect with you in that moment. And so what I've found at least is people feel like they know me before they meet me, and people are able to connect with me deeply just by virtue of hearing me ask questions. So
Mhm.
that's what podcasts do for me. That's what podcasts do for connection. And that's why I find it so amazing to have a show, because it allows me to meet so many people who are meeting me for the first time that I don't even know.
Like us?
Yes, like us, exactly. That's exactly right.
Right, right. So, Danny, so you talk about meeting people, right? So, what questions so far has led you into knowing more about someone? Are there like, typical standard set of questions you start with, or like you've generally been the go-to person in terms of getting interviewed or like trying to say, oh, these are the right set of questions to ask. So, what are some questions that you personally held as favorites because that helped you get deeper in terms of getting to know the personality of people?
I think the most important question to ask is the one that you are genuinely curious to know the answer to in that moment. Like, I think there's something spiritual about asking the quote unquote right question. I think it's
Mhm.
like, what hits you in that moment? And do you have the courage to share it? Do you have the courage to question when you don't understand something? Do you have the courage to look silly? Or do you have the courage
Mm.
to say something that is on your mind that doesn't make sense? To me, the better I've got at listening to that, the better my questions have become. And my whole mission is, how can I tap more deeply into the truth of what I'm feeling so that I can ask the appropriate question or say the appropriate thing in general? I mean, my friend said to me 2 days ago, she said, when you ask a question, it feels like my world stops. And I was like, why? And I and it was because I am genuinely interested in knowing the answer. It's like that is the best question to ask to get to know someone deeper. The question that you genuinely want to know the answer to in this moment, not the one that you thought you were going to want to know 50 minutes ago, right? The question that you want to know right now. And do you have the courage and the trust in yourself to come up with
Mm.
the appropriate question or the appropriate statement in that moment? That is what life is all about to me, trusting myself.
Right. I mean, that's well put. And now what's genuinely making me curious at this point in time is how did you know you got to a point where you felt like, this is exactly how I've grown over time. Like, of course, you would have started the podcast or you would have started your business or pursuit in terms of
Mm.
trying to get better. And over time, you definitely have gotten better. But what were those little milestone marks for you to understand? Yeah, I think this is making me think that I'm actually getting closer towards where I wanted to be. Or this part of me really is something that I thought I would never come to. And but hey, look at me, here I am. So, what were those milestone marks? Because I think this is going to be very different for different people. And I'm genuinely curious to know, like, what was that sign that made you realize that, oh, this is how I've grown.
So in my day to day life, people would often start saying, wow, that's a great question. Wow, that's a great question. Wow, over and over. And
Hmm.
I said to myself, wow, I'm growing. And then more recently, in the past few months, what happens is a lot of times people will start to cry by me asking them questions. And I'm like, wow, I was not doing that a year ago. And I'm not trying to make this person cry. I'm just trying to shine light on their darkness in some way, or more, and I'm curious about their experience. So those two things. First, it was people saying great question over and over, like, or I've never considered that. And now more recently, it's I could actually see the light that's entering their
Wow.
body by virtue of just talking to them. So, but those are like in the personal setting. And I view the podcast as a way to grow personally. So that's kind of how I've realized growth. And that's why I continue doing it, because I'm like, if I never did the podcast, I would not be making people cry by virtue of asking them questions, right? It's that I've honed this skill, and I didn't even realize that's where I was going. But I'm curious to see what happens a year from now or 5 years from. Can it get better? I'm sure it can. You know.
Wow. I mean, like, I really had goosebumps with the part that you talked about here, is because I think that's exactly connecting with what you mentioned about being curious, like going to the depths that probably this person's never thought about themselves in that way. So to make that angle, to make somebody actually realize that there is another way to look at themselves, or there is like another whole path, because I believe in the fact that there's no one identity to a person. There are like a bunch of identities and a bunch of parts put together. And sometimes we are too closely looking at ourselves that we see only one identity or one personality. But then there's somebody whose thoughts or whose vision through which we see ourselves. And there's like, oh, I never knew that there could be this version of me that could exist. Or there is this version of me that was just so deeply there, but never gave me any signs. But hey, here I am. So I think you've probably aced that, or probably I would say those were those milestone marks to tell you that, oh, you are making people enter into an identity that they have not probably reinforced with, or they've probably not met that version of themselves. So I think that's a very, very fascinating thing. So thank you so much for sharing that, Danny.
Of course. And, it makes me think about me talking to a friend recently about how he was upset that he was spending so much time scrolling. And I
Hmm.
said to him, like scrolling me on social media and on Twitter, and he's just scrolling. And he was beating himself up for scrolling. I said, the problem is not that you scroll. The problem is that you are judging yourself for all the scrolling you're doing. Let's look at
Hmm.
all the good that has come from the scrolling. The scrolling has allowed you to start a company. The scrolling has increased your knowledge. The scrolling has put you in this room right now talking to me. The scrolling has given you the ability to understand the world at a deeper level. The scrolling
Hmm.
is you consuming the current version of the way people are perceiving the world. He said, oh my God, this thing that I thought was bad is actually, I'm not giving enough credit to the good. And I think really that you're right in your assessment. Is what I'm doing is I'm giving people new perspectives on their own life by virtue of the questions and by virtue of my interpretation of the things they've done.
Exactly. You're showing them a side that would otherwise be very new for them. And also, like, the best part is they get to keep it for the rest of their life. So it's like,
That's it.
oh, wow, like I just discovered this on Danny's podcast, but then I get to keep this. Like, I get to go on with this for, the rest of the year. So yeah, that's definitely great.
And I
Cool.
don't,
So,
yeah, and I also don't want to say it's just the podcast. Like I really want to say like I do it on the podcast as much as I can, but I also do it in my real life. I do it,
exactly.
in person because that's where it's really that people can't see that, they can't feel that, but
Mhm.
I can. And people, it's a one-on-one deep connection with no cameras there. So I just want to point that out as
Right.
well.
Right. No, I'm actually very glad that you brought that line, because there's also this conception for a lot of people that you have very different worldview when you're going to be online, and you're like a extremely different person when you're offline. And sometimes people do want to keep it that way. Like I have seen people who try to say that, oh, like these are things that I would probably not agree with in person, but hey, it's okay online because I hold a very different belief system, or I have a very, very different way of handling things online. But it's not long enough that you can carry both of these versions. Like there's some point in time, like either both converge or at least come very close in terms of trying to meet each other. And I don't know how that would turn out to be. I mean, like both of those personalities could be completely at loggerheads, or both of those personalities could blend in. One might never know. But the fact that if you are willing to be that person both in real life and also like use parts or portions of that in being online, I think there's some amount of kind of relief that comes out of it, and also makes you take life in a very, smoother way, I would say. So I'm glad that you brought about the real life quotient to it.
Yeah. I think it's something people have to figure out for themselves. How when you change your environment, how much do you change? Do you speak on a podcast the same way you speak to your parents? Do you speak to your
Exactly.
friends? Maybe, maybe not, and I think
Mhm.
understanding that for ourselves is a very important thing to think about as we present
Yes.
ourselves in so many different situations.
Exactly. And this is what we call as self reflection, right? And I think that's the best form of learning about oneself. And that brings me to art of interviewing, which is, I think, your form of introspection, your
Hmm.
form of looking at who really Danny is and what is he great at. Personally, how is it for you, Danny, to take a front row seat, sort of look back at your whole experience of hosting people, trying to really think what's going on in their minds and derive those learnings that could actually condense and give people different worldviews to think about. Was it like giving yourself or putting yourself through a feedback process? Or what are some of those candid learnings that you had from sculpting this whole art of interviewing as a course and also as a way of life?
Yeah, I think you learn so much by teaching, and I learned so much by virtue of putting this resource together because some of it came natural to me, but some of it was things that I built over time, and I wasn't necessarily understanding of how I built it, why I built it, and what was going on behind the surface. What was also the biggest thing I took away was like there's so many different ways to interview effectively. And
Mhm.
if you look at someone like Oprah or Larry King and you compare it to someone like Tim Ferriss, you're looking at two different realities, two different types of
Right.
interviewers, and they both and all do an incredible job. So, what I had a greater appreciation for was just the different ways of communicating and how successfully you can communicate by virtue of being someone who doesn't prepare at all or someone who prepares an extreme amount. And you could still do a great job either way. So I felt more that the biggest thing I learned was there's so many ways to do it well.
Wow. That's a very interesting perspective because I find people like often resort to like one format of saying that, oh, podcasting is all about like having X person preparation, X person doing it, and you have to get to know how to ask great questions. And this is like a constant nightmare for most of them who would want to start a podcast is, how do I sound intelligent? Like, how do I sound extremely smart so that this person who's listening to me understand what to say or like how to derive? But it's coming down to what you just mentioned. It's just trying to know what exact questions to ask because you feel like asking those, like just being silly, but just going on to ask because that makes you learn something about the person and not really caring about, okay, would my listeners find this smart? Like, do I sound smart? And that's the first question. And like, after that, would my listeners make this or like kind of look at it in a smart way? I think that puts in a lot of pressure, and that's why people often like try to ask, hey, how do I do research? How do I basically like go on to know more about this person? So I feel that people have made research a very dirty word, but actually, research is so much fun. Like getting to know about this person before you get a chat with them is so much fun, provided you know how exactly to do that and your intent really matters. So I'm glad that you brought that angle to the art of interviewing as a course and as a whole means of getting conversations up with other people.
Yeah, and I think that it's not about sounding intelligent. It's about, are you being truthful to yourself in any given moment? Are you
Hmm.
actually saying the thing that's on your mind? And I'm happy you noted that. And research for me is how I help the person get more comfortable in their own skin. It's how I tell the person I'm speaking to, hey, I like you for you. Just be you because you're great.
Exactly.
And I just show appreciation for them in a subtle way by doing that research.
Yep. Yep. Totally agree. And it's like you always have your eyes on your own paper, right? Because you
Hmm.
take it with your flow. You're like, okay, this is what the world believes in, but if Danny believes in this, this is exactly, how it should be because I truly get to benefit from this. Are there like accidental moments or what we would call as those serendipitous ways through which life has shown you otherwise? It's like, oh, like I really didn't expect this to come together at this time, but it just happened. And this is the way that this opportunity led me here. What are some of those serendipity kind of moments that is helped you so far?
Oh man. Where do I begin? Well, one that comes to mind immediately is how Andy Frisella came about on
Hmm.
the podcast. Andy Frisella is the creator of 75 Hard, this wonderful program that changed my life around the same time I started meditating,
Right?
September 2019. Maybe like the same day that I started meditating, I did 75 Hard for the first time. For those who are unfamiliar, 75 Hard is a program where for 75 days straight, you read 10 pages of a book, you do two workouts, 45 minutes each, you drink a gallon of water, you read 10 pages of a book, you follow a diet, and you take a progress picture.
Wow.
And so you do that for 75 days straight. And Andy Frisella created this program. And so to me, interviewing him was like would be an incredible accomplishment from the start of the podcast, because I started the podcast a year after I did the program for the first time. And
Mm-hmm.
then what happened was I saw a guy on Twitter wanted to start a podcast. I was like, okay, like I can help you start a podcast if you're interested. And I sent him a DM saying that. I got on the phone, spoke with him for maybe 30 minutes, and he sends me a text message back. Hey, do you want Andy Frisell on your podcast? It's like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And turns out he had a friend who knew Andy closely and found a way to make it happen. And that was completely unexpected, completely not my
Mhm.
intention when I was reaching out to help him with his podcast. And it just was a little wink from the universe of like, keep going along this path. You're doing great. Keep it up. And yeah, just a wonderful moment for sure.
Well, I'm so glad that it probably kickstarted or made you more of getting in the flow with the podcast, because I feel that if not for bringing immediate wealth or immediate rewards, I feel these serendipitous moments are like those sparks that make you believe a little more in your journey. I mean, it might probably not uh, give you like an immediate sense, but there are times that I've always looked back at saying that, oh, if I connect back, if this moment had not happened, I don't think I would be where I am, or I wouldn't think that a certain thing would have happened. And I know it like goes back to a very stereotypical way of saying connecting the dots, but I think serendipitous moments are largely like that. It's not often that you get to know the truth of them at that point in time, but definitely hits back. And the way it is like a domino effect, right? It connects, keeps giving back and back. It's not like a one-time occurrence kind of a thing. If there's a spark, I think that spark has an effect on a million little things that come after that. So I'm pretty sure that you would have had a very similar thing after getting him on the podcast. I think the next couple of things would have been like connecting to the serendipitous moment.
It's all connected. Every moment is connected to the last. And it's like, even though I recognize that as a serendipitous moment, every moment
Mm.
is serendipitous. Wherever your consciousness is at that point in time is serendipitous, because billions of years got us to exactly this point. So how can you argue with
Well, I don't think I can, because
it?
that's exactly the right way that you put it. And now it seems all like logical. Yeah. Why would you argue with it? Like, are you mad? But yeah, completely agree with that. And wow, Danny, I think this was a fantastic conversation. I think to me, it was more like we were just like dialing each other on the phone, just as how you mentioned a few minutes ago, like just trying to talk out and trying to bring through those perspectives that we would otherwise sit down in a cafe and probably have coffee and then discuss things over. I mean, to me, it didn't really sound like I was putting questions to you, but it was more like picking each other's brain. And I'm so glad that you brought in a lot of perspectives around what made you choose a certain, creative journey, and what does that seem like in the years to come. So I hope the listeners also like try to use some of what they could relate with you. Like I said, those parts that could blend with what you've tried to achieve. So thank you so much for bringing again.
Yeah, thank you so much for the thoughtful questions. I really appreciated your time, your energy, and for being here today.
Yep. And when Danny says it's thoughtful, I'm going to like really take that no, with attentive pride, because it is coming from the person who probably is great at questions. So yeah, it means a lot to me. Thank you.
My pleasure. Sure.